Ghoulish greetings and welcome to the YouTube channel for the Satanic Coven of the Dark Goat. This is Michigan Ghoul calling, and the focus of this sermon will be on the history and development of the Black Mass. Now, the immediate problems that confront putting together a program like this are two. The first one is the unreliability of records, because certain archives were invented by the Christians, Muslims, and so forth to serve their own interests. So there's no way of verifying some of this information. We just have to kind of play it by ear. And the other problem is many of the confessions obtained, especially during the Middle Ages, were obtained under brutal torture and or under penalty of death. So again, we have to consider that some people were saying things that the inquisitors wanted to hear. Another problem we do have that comes up almost incidentally is how is a Black Mass defined? Now, as Dr. LaVey pointed out in his Satanic Rituals, that a Black Mass is sometimes thought of as any type of satanic ceremony, and more to the point as well, a lot of religious fanatics think that anything non-Christian, even Santeria, Voodoo, Hoodoo, Palo Mayombe, even some forms of Catholicism, they consider them as quote-unquote satanic. So we really have to be careful as we're separating things, and sometimes the lines will overlap in a program such as this. But what I did find in reading and researching this is that the origins of the Black Mass lie mainly in satire and parody. There were masses invented, such as the Drinker's Mass, as well as a short piece from the year 1200 that we'll go over a little bit in a minute, called the Evangelium Secundum Marcus Argenti, or Gospel According to Silver Mark. The latter is a short piece in which the Pope is depicted as being extremely unjust and greedy, which of course he is. In many ways, the Gospel According to the Silver Mark was the ultimate biting satire of its time. It's a very short piece, but it's very concise, and it carries a very clear message of condemnation against the gluttony and the greed of the church at the time. It starts out with a poor cleric coming to the Pope and saying, "Can you please help a fellow brother?" But the Pope tells him, quote, "Friend, you and your poverty can go to hell. Get thou behind me, Satan, because you do not smell of money. Amen, amen. I say to you, you shall not enter into the joy of your Lord the Pope until you pay your last farthing." So of course the poor man goes away dejected. Later, a rich man comes to the curia and he bribes everyone. He's described as being gross and fat and swollen. He's committed treacherous murder. Then describes the Pope as being sick unto death after he hears about the bribery. So it says the rich man sends the Pope medicine in the form of gold and silver, and the Pope was straightway healed. The Pope then tells his brethren cardinals, "Brethren, be vigilant, lest anyone deceive you with empty words. My example I give unto you, that you may just grab and grab as I grab." Now, if anyone can find a clearer example of the excesses of the church at the time and a way of pushing satire to dissolve such excesses and to expose them to the people, I would like to hear it, because this is probably one of the best pieces I've ever read along those lines. In 1325, the Irish village of Kilkenny, there was a woman named Alice Kyteler, or Cateller, I'm not sure exactly how that's pronounced, there's no pronunciation guides, who was conducting so-called unholy rites, and the history of the proceedings against her are in the British Museum at this time. It's been edited among the publications of the Camden Society by a man named Thomas Wright, and in the original notes from the year 1325, we get the following text, which I'll read word for word at this point. It says, "In their nightly meetings they blasphemy, imitated the power of the church by fulminating sentence of excommunication with lighted candles, even against their own husbands, from the sole of their foot to the crown of their head, naming each part expressively, and then concluding by extinguishing, in order to arouse feelings of love or hatred, or to inflict death or disease on the bodies of the faithful. They made use of powders, unguents, ointments, and candles of fat, which were composed as follows. They took the entrails of cocks sacrificed to demons, certain horrible worms, various unspecified herbs, dead men's nails, the hair, brains, and shreds of the cerements of boys who were buried unbaptized, and other abominations, all of which they cooked with various incantations over a fire of oak log in a vessel made out of the skull of a decapitated thief." Now, if some of that sounds a little bit far-fetched to say the least. It probably was. Again, we're dealing with records that were written by people who had ulterior motives in this. It did stand, however, and the people at the time took it quite seriously. The point I do want to make, though, is the point about the decapitated thief. The executed thief theme keeps coming back repeatedly throughout occult lore with the Hand of Glory and so forth, and that's not the last time we're going to see that. We'll see it again in future readings. Right, now we come to the thorny issue of Baron Gilles de Retz, or de Retz, however you wish to pronounce it. He was also known as Bluebeard. He was convicted after 110 witnesses testified against him that he had disemboweled, dismembered, beheaded, and tortured young children in various rites of his. He was eventually hung over a burning fire on October 26th, 1440 in France. We want to get this out of the way fairly quick because there's a popular misconception that he was actually a Satanist or indulged in black masses. Actually, nothing could be further from the truth. It was said by reliable witnesses that the Baron begged and cried for forgiveness at the end when he was threatened with excommunication from the church. So rather than thinking of him as a Satanist, he was in fact a very religious man who was suffering from some type of severe mental disorder or sadistic impulses. We need to make that very clear at this time. There was one report that he had participated in a quote-unquote black mass in which an invisible force beat one of the participants black and blue and he took off running, but aside from that one allegation, there's no confirmation that he was involved with black masses or any type of serious black magic in any way beyond that. If, like myself, any of you are fans of written satire through the ages, I would strongly recommend reading the short text of the Missa du Potatoribus, the Mass of the Drinkers, or Mass of the Drunkards, from 1500. It's a very well-written satirical piece that contains lines such as, "I confess to the all-drinking culprit Bacchus, and the accursed red wine, and to all his dishes, and you drinkers, that I have drunk most excessively, gluttonously, through great sickness of the culprit Bacchus, my God." There's also declarations such as, "Fraud be with you, and with your groaning, let us drink." And the short little mass satire ends with, "Fraud be with you, etc. Go, the purse is empty. Thanks be to the culprit." It was originally translated into English by Michael W. George, and I believe you can also find it in Martha Bailey's In Parody of the Middle Ages, the Latin translation, published in 1997. Now, in the early 1500s, Cornelius Agrippa wrote many writings. He wrote 4 books that I have, the occult histories. He didn't address the Black Mass directly, but in his Occult Philosophy 3, he did offer a reference to quote-unquote infernal invocations and by deadly sacrifices and wicked oblations in reference to certain occultists of the left-hand path. Also, in the same book on page 79, he gives us this quote referring to diverse names of religions and superstitions and sacrifices, ceremonies, feasts, consecrations, dedications, vows, devotions, expiations, oaths, offerings, satisfactory work, by which the seduced Gentiles did sacrifice to the false gods and devils. Now, in moving to the Occult Philosophy 4 book of his, page 47 has a rather interesting paragraph here that I'll read again word for word because it is worth it to our purpose here. Quote-unquote, "Buried carcasses cast abroad, here noses and fingers, there the fleshy nails of those that were hanged, and in another place the blood of them that were murdered, and their skulls mangled with the teeth of wild beasts. Then she offers a sacrifice." He's referring to a witch here, by the way. "Their enchanted entrails, laying, panting, and sprinkles them with diverse kinds of liquors, sometimes with fountain water, sometimes with cow's milk, sometimes with mountain honey and mead. Then she ties those hairs into knots and lays them on the fire with diverse order to be burned." And then finally on page 52, "For Saturn take the seed of black poppy, of henbane, root of mandrake, the lodestone, and myrrh, and make them up with the brain of a cat or the blood of a bat." Now, the reason I'm mentioning that last quote is because we'll see the blood of the bat coming up as an occult ingredient very soon. And we see once again, of course, the part of someone who was hanged mentioned. It never hurts to emphasize that fact that that's always brought up in occult lore. We now come to the rite known as La Messa Nera di Caterina di Medici, 1574. This is one of those that I view with some suspicion because, for one thing, the translation I have is almost incomprehensible, and it sounds a bit too far-fetched because it involves the king, the queen, along with a renegade priest and a boy with a man coming along with him for some reason. Basically, there's two wafers, one black and one white. They are used as a sacrifice to the demons Nibiros and Lucifuge. At the end of the ceremony, it mentions that a child is decapitated and a black wafer is placed either under the head or in the mouth. An inverted cross is used too. But again, I don't really believe this one necessarily. This was something that was invented by the inquisitors of the time, and I wouldn't take this very seriously. On to Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly, who were active primarily during the years of 1583 to 1587. There's no evidence that either one of them ever participated in or authored any sort of black mass. However, mentioning them in this book is essential for a couple of reasons. For one thing, they were the authors and founders of what we now know as the Enochian Keys or Enochian Calls, so they should be remembered for this and mentioned as such. And also, they were involved in scrying and necromancy extensively, which some people may erroneously believe is a form of black mass. We just need to mention them, however, in passing, because the Left Hand Path does owe them a great debt for all the work they did on our behalf, however indirectly. At this point, we'll speak very briefly of a document known as the Mass of Saint Seker. I found it on the internet, and there's very few resources to back this up. I haven't found this in any books or any magic documents. It just came from the Middle Ages by word of mouth, supposedly, so I'd advise caution in believing it. It allegedly involved a renegade priest reciting the Mass backwards at a certain desolate area, like an abandoned church was cited, a cemetery or moors and so forth, and the priest would consecrate a black host and water from a well where an unbaptized infant was drowned. He would do this at the stroke of midnight at the very end when the Mass would end. Now, again, I really would advise caution in believing anything along these lines. I don't know of any independent source of confirmation on that, so I cannot speak to it, but it's just worth mentioning in passing. In the year 1614 or 1615, there was a sorcerer named Sylvain Nevelan who claimed that urine was used as holy water with the declaration Aspergis Diaboli in a black mass that was held, and Gentian Leclerc, an excommunicated Catholic priest, also went along with that and verified it by saying, quote-unquote, the holy water was yellow. Now, that's the first time that I could find urine being used in conjunction with a black mass, but we'll see that appear several more times down the road. Now, if we move ahead just slightly to the year 1633, the Catholic priest Urbain Grandier was accused, convicted, and burned alive for writing Pactum Satanicum, or at least allegedly writing it. He denied it, but it didn't seem to help. He was convicted and burned at the stake, screaming denials all the time. The elements of this text were also used as part of the Coven Mass, which we'll see later from 1968, and the Merciful Fate song from 1983, Don't Break the Oath. And then I will give you the English translation of the Pactum Satanicum at this time. It starts out in Latin as Domine Mesteric Lucifer te Deum et Principem agnostico et policior tibi servi et obedir quan Dio potero viveri et renuncio alteram Deum et Iesum Christum et alio sanctus atque sanctus et ecclesiasum apostolicum et romanum et omnia ipsius sacramenta et omnes oratius et rogationis cubis fidelis possunt intercede pro me et tibi policior quid factium quot malum potero et atrahir et mala per omnes et ab nuncio Christiam et baptismum et omnia merita Iesu Christi et ipsia sacratorum et si dero tua servitia et adorationani et si non oblatornum mea ipsius fecero tir QQD tibidu vitam meam sicutum fisi hoc anno et di urb grandior ex factum ex infernus. Now, the translation that I've been able to put together using several different online translators as well as a Latin dictionary goes something like this: Lord and Master Lucifer, thou art God and the original source of knowledge, and to you I promise to serve and obey as long as we can and we are still alive. I renounce the altar of God and Jesus Christ and other holy and also pious things, and the Church of the Apostles and Rome and all of the sacraments and all prayers and measures that can intercede on my behalf to me, and to you I promise to build and be drawn to evil forever, and renounce the Christian baptism and all the merits of Jesus Christ and his sacraments, and if your servant wants to serve and adore, and if not, offering my personal commitment 3 times likewise every day to you, I dedicate my life to you, made this day and year, herb grandeur written in hell. Now, the part that I want to draw your attention to is the section where it says, I renounce the altar of God, Jesus Christ, other holy and pious things, the church. That theme is repeated several times down through the Black Mass and related documents, and we'll see that pop up as we go further into this study. The Black Mass is celebrated by Abbe Etienne Guibourg and Catherine Deschaze ni Monvoisin, aka Lavoisin, generally included making small jars of substances for royals and well-to-do people who had private wishes that were stated and prayed for during the Mass. Some of these substances that were used in these jars included salt, flour, the host, holy water, male semen, female semen or menstrual blood, placentas. In the making of her spell kits, Madame Lavoisin was also known to use the bones of toads, the teeth of moles, Spanish flies, iron fillings, human blood, and mummy dust. One of the points against Madame Lavoisin that's come up over the ages and that's been misinterpreted is that she and the priests that she employed sacrificed young children and or babies. This isn't exactly true. There were actually abortions and or miscarriages used in the rituals, and what would happen is Abbe Guibourg would cut the throat of the aborted baby, fetus, however you wish to describe it, and spread the bloody mess across the naked torso of the woman for whom the Mass was being said. Then the mixture, the aforementioned substances, would be put together in a bottle and given to the woman after the spell was cast. Lavoisin's own daughter did testify against her and mention the baby, in other words the abortion, having its throat cut, blood poured into the chalice, consecrated with the host, and then Abbe Guibourg would finish the Mass. She also said that Guibourg took out the fetus's entrails and it was used in a separate ceremony. Interestingly enough, while Abbe Guibourg did deny opening the fetus's body, he did in fact agree that he had torn out the heart and the entrails and used it for a Black Mass at a later time. Now this next piece comes from a document called Memoire Autographe de M. de Argentensen. It concerns a priest, not Guibourg in this case, but a priest, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Guignard, who said Mass in priest's vestments. And I'm going to quote this word for word actually, because this is worth it for the purpose of this sermon, that he celebrated it once on the body of a penitent, naked, without a shirt, and that Subdeacon Sebald, who was naked as she was, said the responses to the Mass. As often as the altar had to be kissed, Guignard kissed Carmelien's body, that's the woman, and consecrated the host on her private parts, into which he inserted a fragment of the host. When the Mass was at last ended, the subdeacon Sebald entered into her, and meanwhile Guignard and his friend also copulated with a woman named Lefebvre. When the Mass was over, Sebald plunged his hands into the chalice and washed his private parts and the woman's. Guignard, this other individual, and Lefebvre did the same. After this, Guignard put what remained in the chalice into a little vial in other words, which he carried away carefully. In 2011, I composed a solo version of the Guibourg Mass using parts of the Missa Solemnis as well as original material believed to have been used in the original Guibourg Mass. The composition of the potion to be used would include sea salt, flour, the so-called host, so-called holy water, male semen, female semen, and or menstrual blood, placenta cream, bat paperweight, to be used in lieu of bat blood and just to be placed on the altar, and bird blood, which by the way can be obtained in the form of czarnina, black soup, which is a Polish delicacy. I also use the phrase ego denego Jesum Christum discipio et alterum Deum et ecclesiastium apostolicum et Romanum et omnia mea ipsius sacramentia et oratianus, which roughly translates into I deny Jesus Christ the deceiver and the altar of God and the apostles and the Roman Church and all of my sacraments and promises. In Latin, I took from the original Guiberg Mass as well the text Astaroth, Amadeus, Princes of Friendship. I conjure you to accept the sacrifice I offer you of this child for the things I ask of you, which are, and then the desire is stated, and the child, of course, is symbolized by the placenta cream. Now, the Marquis de Sade, who wrote during the 1770s and 1780s in France and was eventually committed to an asylum by Napoleon before he passed on at the age of 74, it's worth quoting him because although he was a fanatical atheist, he did have a very unique twist on the Black Mass in his novels, The 120 Days of Sodom and Justine and Juliet. He wrote several things that should be quoted here at this time, and apologies are offered in advance if there's anyone who's offended by coarse language, but I do think this is worth quoting in the context of this sermon. One quote is, he breaks up a crucifix, smashes several images of the Virgin and the Eternal Father, shits upon the debris, and burns the whole mess. The same man has mania of bringing a whore to hear the sermon and having himself frigged while listening to the Word of God. He interrupts a priest in the midst of saying Mass in his private chapel. Interrupts him, I say, in order to frig himself into the chalice, obliges the whore to frig the priest thereinto, and forces the latter to quaff the mead. He intervenes directly, the host is consecrated, and forces the priest to fuck the whore with the host. The same evening, the bishop consecrates a host, and Curville destroys Hebe's maidenhead with it. He drives it into her cunt, and discharges thereupon. Several others are consecrated, and the already duplicated sultanas are all fucked with the hosts. And you'll see, by the way, where this element ties in with the 1985 Missa Niger as we move on. Alphonse Louis Constant, who was better known as Eliphas Levi, was a white lighter, generally is considered to be so, but I did find in reading some of his writings that he had an almost giddy attitude toward the dark side of things, and some of these writings, as you see, which I'll read in just a moment, may have been borrowed from liberally from the Mass of Saint Sicare document we just spoke of, possibly from the Lavoisian and Guibourg Masses as well. We're going to be quoting from the book Dogma et Rituel de la Haute Magique Part 2, published in 1896. The Sabbath of the Sorcerers is the chapter we're focusing on. Eliphas Levi, by the way, was born on February 8th, 1810, and died on May 31st, 1875, with this book being published, obviously, after his death. Some of the quotes that we see in here include references to, and this is a direct quote, profane the ceremonies of the cultists, in which we believe offer a bloody sacrifice. And we go down a bit and we see also the quote, a solitary and forbidden spot must be chosen, such as a cemetery haunted by evil spirits, a dreaded ruin in the country, the vaults of an abandoned convent, a place where some murder has been committed, a druidic altar, or an old temple of idols. A black seamless and sleeveless robe must be provided, 2 candles of human fat set in black wooden candlesticks carved in the shape of a crescent. Now that definitely sounds like it's been influenced by the Lavoisian and Guibourg crowd. He goes on to describe the needed items for such a mass. He says a censer holding perfumes, namely incense, camphor, aloes, ambergris, and storax, mixed together with the blood of a goat, a mole, and a bat. Again, we see bat blood's reference. 4 nails taken from the coffin of an executed criminal, the head of a black cat which has been nourished on human flesh for 5 days, a bat drowned in blood, the horns of a goat cum cul puella concuperate, and the skull of a parricide. Now, one point I want to make too, while we've discussed people like John Dee and Louis Constant and Cornelius Agrippa, is that they made use of Christian documents and Christian prayers and so forth, and that caused a lot of Satanists and people on the left-hand path in general to scorn them. But we have to be a bit merciful, so to speak, toward them. We can't be too hard on them because I believe in many ways and in many instances all that pro-Christian and pro-Jewish fawning was just a pragmatic matter for them. It was just a matter of survival, in other words, because remember, people like Lavoisier and Urbain Grandier who were burned at the stake. So I don't think that we can be terribly hard on them, and we need to really read between the lines when we're reading some of their material and read the spirit of what they're saying, not necessarily all of the references to Jesus and the Holy Father and so forth. At this time, we're going to discuss the novel La Basse in some detail. It was written in 1891, published in France, and it's been translated alternately as The Damned or Down There, depending on who's doing the translation and what their interpretation of it is. It's historical fiction written by a man named J.K. Huysmans. Portions of the Black Mass that he wrote about were used later, as we'll see, in 20th century masses, and it's strongly believed that he was most likely a personal witness, or at least he knew someone close to him who had seen an actual Black Mass due to the detail he went into in the novel. Now, the interesting thing here is that the desecration that we'll see later was used by Reverend West in the Missa Solemnis, as well as in the Messe Noire by LaVey. The text has been lifted almost, basically word for word in many sections from the La Basse novel. More interesting still, though, is in 1893 there was a defrocked Catholic priest named Joseph Antoine Bouillon who practiced unorthodox rites that seemed, from what I could tell in reading, to be a mixture between Catholicism and Satanism. It was sort of along the lines of Paolo Miombi, if you've ever read about that. It invokes the saints and invokes God, but at the same time it invokes the dark powers. It's sort of a dualist nature. There was rumors that he was having black masses, exorcism involving forced feeding of feces to nuns who were allegedly possessed by demons, and even child sacrifice has been levied against him as a slur or a truth. Either way, it can never be known for sure. What we do know for reasonable certainty, though, is that he did found a branch of the Church of Carmel, and he knew J.K. Huysmans, the author of La Basse, and the two of them were friends. We come now to a discussion over the man some feel was history's biggest fraud. Other people feel he was the very source of wisdom revealed, namely Aleister Crowley, the Beast 666, as he called himself. He wrote a Gnostic Mass in 1913, and while it's not a black mass per se, we're still going to go into it in brief detail because of the similarities involved. Instead of using a Missa or a black book of some sort, or Book of Shadows, he used his Book of the Law that he wrote. Also, children are used as altar boys and altar girls, and the quote that comes from this is, "I believe the serpent and the lion, mystery of mysteries, in his name, Baphomet." Now that right away should tip us off to some type of satanic inference in his rituals. A sword was used as well, as was a coffin as part of this ritual. The place where there's certainly some differences, however, is that there is a gold crown and a scarlet robe placed on the priest during the coronation part of the ceremony. What this harkens back to, and it's kind of interesting, is that's almost a word-for-word description of the whore of Babylon that's spoken of in the biblical book of Revelations, the whore wearing the scarlet robe, the same as Crowley described. Later in the ritual, there are many names invoked, historical names, and some of them are Richard Wagner, Alphonse Louis Constant, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Crowley himself. As opposed to any type of host being used as a desecration, there are cakes of light used and wine, and it's venerated rather than desecrated. The quote, "Be this bread the body of God, be this wine the blood of God," is used during the ceremony. The priestess and the other officers never do partake of the sacrament because it's believed in Crowley's ceremony that their soul is transferred into the wafers and the wine and is given to the followers themselves. We'll now speak of the Messe Luciferian Mass, also known as the Little Church of Paris, which is translated from Pierre Guérand, Le Petit Église de Paris, 1937. This Mass starts out with the introitus of In Nomine Domini de Nostre Satanas Luciferi Excelsior, and it goes on to include the statement, "Satan who rebelled against yourself gloriously, Adonai and his Christ we praise you." Adonai is the the name used by this priest that was supposedly saying this mass for the God of heaven. He admits that Christ is cursed, and he goes on to do a blessing, not in the cross of the Christian, but in the tau of the Gnostics. The host is raised, and the words, "This is my body, this is my blood," are spoken. It says the priest had no emotion while doing this, and he later went on to do the prayer that was worded, "Evil Adonai, who art in heaven, may your name be blasphemed, thy kingdom vanishes, they will rise up against your angels, and men on earth as in heaven, Paris cursed, as died on the cross, Christ your Son, may your name be delivered to oblivion forever now." And then the ceremony concludes with the taking of the bread and wine in the name of Satan to blaspheme Christ. During March of 1963 in Bedfordshire County, England, at St. Mary's Church there was an alleged black mass celebrated by some Satanists who, according to what I've been able to dig up, have never been caught. They exhumed 6 graves at the churchyard and laid the bones out on the altar. There were also inverted crosses chalked on the walls, and a rooster was allegedly sacrificed. This information came from the Encyclopedia of Devil Worship and Satanic Crime by Michael Newton. Plus, I was also able to find some independent information by the local historian that was posted online regarding this event, and the two sources of information basically backed each other up, so we can validate this claim. We come now to the 1968 Black Mass put out by the band Coven. This one had some unique characteristics to it, as well as some strikingly similar characteristics to the LaVeyan invocation to Satan, as we'll see in a few moments. The Coven Mass begins with Enochian and then a Latin introitus style. The priest then calls upon Satan, Beelzebub, Leviathan, and Amadeus, after which a reverse Our Father is read word by word. A penitent then enters, who in this instance is depicted as a young naive girl, and takes an oath that includes the "I deny Jesus Christ the Deceiver" text that we saw was used in 1633 and would later be used in the Merciful Fate song "Don't Break the Oath" in 1984. This Mass is unique in one aspect, in that I have never seen another Mass, or another rite for that matter, use the shavings from a clock, which I would assume were our wood. The analogy is then made that just as the shavings cannot be returned to the clock, so your soul can never return to God. The penitent is then commanded to kiss the goat, in this case the posterior of a man dressed as a goat. The girl then strips and lies naked as part of the altar, and a skull full of blood, which it doesn't specify if that's real or imitation blood, is placed on her belly. It does give the rather disturbing mention that for major Sabbaths an unbaptized baby would be sacrificed. However, there's no evidence that the band ever participated in such activity, and the mention was probably made more for shock value than anything else. Toward the end, the congregation tramples on the host after a denunciation is read, and the initiate, or neophyte as it's used in the text here, is then used by all of the congregants thereof who participate in an orgy after the Mass. The Mass was written and composed as part of an album that was released in 1968 called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. The style of Coven's music, it wasn't metal, it was more so a darker version of the Morrison, Hendrix, Joplin type rock of that day. Right, now on to the glaring similarities between the Coven invocation and the LaVeyan invocation. To quote from the Coven Mass, "In the name of Satan, ruler of the earth, the king of the world, the chief of the serfs, I command the forces of darkness to bestow their infernal powers upon us." Now, from the Satanic Bible we have, "In the name of Satan, ruler of the earth, the king of the world, I command the forces of darkness to bestow their infernal powers upon me." I won't make any implications here. I'll just let the listener judge his or her own conclusions from what I've just read. The Missa Solemnis was composed by a British-born defrocked Catholic priest named Wayne Forrest West. He's the only man known to have been a priest in both the Catholic and the Satanic religions, and to have been excommunicated from both, the latter by Anton LaVey in 1971. After leaving England, he moved to Berkeley, Michigan, and lived on Woodward Avenue in an apartment at an address that no longer exists. Word is that he dropped out around 1976 and has had no contact with anyone on the left-hand path since then. The Missa contains many Latin phrases, such as introibo ad altare de nostre, go to the altar of our Lord, ad de nostre Satanus Luciferi, to our Lord Satan Lucifer. There are different sections of the Missa which are organized quite well, I believe, and they're organized along the lines of the Trinidine Mass. Of course, everything is inverted, as the Christians would say. The Introitus starts it out, and that's entirely in Latin, dialogue between the priest, the deacon, and the subdeacon. There's then the Confiteor. During the Confiteor, a chamber pot is brought out and presented to the woman playing the part of the nun, who then urinates in it, and said liquid is used as a blessing toward the congregants. This practice, we might recall, was also used by Genitin de Clercq in 1615, so it does have quite a history. Now, the interesting part, I've mentioned before that the Missa Solemnis has many Latin references. There's a phrase here that is used at that point, which is written down as Ave Maria ad mecuriendum festinant, which roughly translates into Hail Mary, hurry, or hasten to piss. That was added by Reverend West. I've never seen that one used anywhere else, and it does show that in spite of what some people thought of his false claims of being a former Catholic priest, he did have quite a strong command of the Latin language, which in those days would have been nearly impossible to get, I would think, without being part of the Catholic clergy. And after that blessing, we move on a bit to the Gloria, and glory be to thee, Almighty Satan, highest and ineffable King of hell, joy on earth to the followers of the left-hand path. And that short section is followed by the epistle. The epistle section is again an homage to Satan, and it contains the words, the God of darkness has kindled the light of Lucifer in our hearts, whose shining is to be made known all of his glory. That basically sums up the general theme of the epistle. It's read by the priest as a type of sermon to the congregants and to the deacon and subdeacon and the nun. The oratio takes place there, as well as the gradual. Now the gradual, it's an interesting section because it contains quotations from the book of Leviticus that directly contradict each other, and I'm sure Reverend West put that in there for humor's sake. It says, the high priest, the one that is chief among his brethren, who is consecrated for the priestly office, and who wears the sacred vestments, is altogether like his brethren. But we see then only 2 verses up in the same book of Leviticus, chapter 21, verse 8, the priest must be set apart, as I am set apart, the Lord of hell who fulfills you. That's a quote from the Bible that basically tells us the priest must be set apart, yet not set apart. So I believe, not only for the inversion's sake, but I think he put that in there as a humorous twist of the contradictions in the Christian Bible. The phrase Sequentia Sancti Evangelii Secundum Sancta Biblia Nostrae follows, and then the Gospel of the 5th Enochian key is read. The Desecration Offertorium section follows after that, which was considered by Reverend West to be the most solemn part of the Mass. It should be pointed out that the first part of the desecration text was appropriated, borrowed, shall we say, from the 1891 French novel La Basse. I know this because I have a copy of it, and it reads word for word in many sections. In any case, though, it's a phenomenal declaration, and I don't have time to read it at this time, but it can be found elsewhere on this site. It's something that everyone on the left-hand path should read, I believe. Now, the desecration consists of the reading of this said incantation, and then the host, consecrated or otherwise, is ground in a wooden bowl with a pestle, and Reverend West suggested rough-hewn wood for this purpose, he said, because that symbolizes the cross of Calvary. The host is then dropped into a burning bowl and incinerated by the white candle of the altar, along with some incense. And the words are then spoken, vanish into nothingness, thou fool of fools, thou vile and rotten pretender to the throne of Almighty Satan, the true God of gods. Vanish into the void of thy empty heaven, for thou never wert, nor shall thou ever be. The final words spoken are consummatum est, and what that is a translation of is, it is done, supposedly spoken by the false Christ on the cross. The 4 princes of hell are then conjured, whoever is playing the priest role in this, and brought into the ceremony formally. The consecratio then follows with the subdeacon speaking and removing the garments of the priest bit by bit, until at last the priest stands naked and says, "Glory to thee, O Lord of lords, true God of gods, the highest and ineffable King of hell. I give thee thanks for thy great glory, and refresh myself in nakedness before thy sight." Now, at that point, a black mantle of darkness, as it was called by Reverend West, a black hooded robe, in other words, is placed on the priest, and he is formally inducted into the left-hand path. The priest then masturbates onto a silver spoon until he reaches a climax, and that is part of the second offertorium, which starts out with words taken from the book of Ecclesiastics that says, "In me gratia omnius via et veritatis, in me omnius spes vitar et feturus, ego quasi rosa planta super rovos, aquarium fructifacave." The veni is then spoken. The wording is, "Veni sanctificator omnipotens aeternae diablos, et benedic hoc sacrificium, tu inferno nomine preparatum," which basically means, "Come, mighty and eternal sanctifier, and bless this sacrifice which is prepared in thy infernal name." The previous quote, by the way, from Ecclesiastics, there is a translation for that as well, and the quote is roughly, "In me is all grace of the way and of the truth. In me is all hope of life and virtue. As a rose planted by the water brooks, I have budded forth." The Mass continues on with the raising of the spoon, the raising of the chalice, the mixing of the contents of the spoon and the chalice, and then the raising of the completed product as an offering. The kiss of brotherhood is then done between the deacon and the subdeacon and the priest. The priest blesses the altar at that point to indicate the closing of the Missa Solemnis with the words, "Benedict vos omnipotens diablos et pax suum sit semper vobiscum," which is basically, "May the peace of Almighty Satan be with you." The last gospel being read, the 15th Enochian key in Reverend West's text, with again the words, "Sequentia Sanctia Evangelii Secundum Sancta Biblia Nostrae," a reading from our gospel. And the priest then rings the bell the 9 times and concludes with the words, "So it is done." Okay, we come now to the mid-80s Black Mass called the Missa Najir. Now, what's unique about this Mass is it was released in 1986, allegedly by a man named Bernard King, who wrote it under the pseudonym of Aubrey Mellick. And it is said by some sources that this Mass was released as a publicity stunt, essentially, for the movie Angel Heart, which came out in 1987. I didn't know this before reading the article, but Melech is the Hebrew word for king. Now, the text of this Mass, which we'll focus on and ignore the other sections as far as the movie and the author's name and so forth, is actually very well written, one of the best written that I've seen. It's divided into 5 sections. The introit, which is similar to the Missa Solemnis and dialogue between the participants, followed by the offertory, which offers stolen host and wine to Satan. The canon is the 3rd part, which affirms the beliefs. Then you have the consecration, which again is similar to the Missa Solemnis, and it's really the most blasphemous part of the ceremony. It contains the phrase, "Hec est corpus Jesu Christi," here is the body of Jesus Christ, which was also used very closely by Anton LaVey in his 1976 Messa Noir, if we recall. The repudiation is the last part of the Mass, in which the phrase "Esci corpus Jesu Christi Dominus humilium ex rex servanorum" is read, which is, "Behold the body of Jesus Christ, Lord of the humble and King of the slaves." At the end, the Mass basically, some would say, denigrates or evolves, however you wish to put it, into a mass orgy between the participants. The host used in the Mass is also placed on the priest's penis and inserted into the vagina of the altar. Undoubtedly influenced by de Sade's writings, to wit, he intervenes directly. The host is consecrated and forces the priest to fuck the whore with the host. O&A Black Mass. The O&A Black Mass consists of the participants including an altar priest who lays naked upon the altar, a priestess in white robes, a mistress of the earth in scarlet robes, a master in purple robes, and the congregation in black robes. This is usually conducted indoors, and while this ceremony is copyrighted and I don't intend to infringe on anyone's copyright, I'll just give a brief description of some of the elements that stand out in this Black Mass as opposed to some of the others. Hazel is burned as the incense, also mixed with civet. The civet is interesting because when I did some scrying with the demon Sidragrosum, it came up that civet was one of his herbs. This Mass also is unique in that it calls for several chalices, and it calls for very strong wine, which is unique that I've found in the Black Masses. The hosts are actually baked by the priestess and not obtained from a church or made to look like those that came from a church. However, the patens used, the silver patens with the host or hosts, it says should be obtained from a Nazarene place of worship. That's another interesting variation on the Black Mass here. Instead of bells, they appear to use hand claps, which is another interesting variation. But when you really think about it, a good hand clap is about as good to clear the air as a bell, I would think, sound-wise. The priest, during one of the beginning parts of the Mass, is kissed on the penis by the priestess who conducts the Mass in most cases, at least in the version that I have. Now, this one quote I will cite just as a fair use note, because it's a very good quote. It's one that could be used for anybody. It says, "With pride in my heart, I give praise to those who drove the nails, and he who thrust the spear into the body of Yeshua, the impostor. May his followers rot in hell in their rejection and filth." That's quite a commanding statement, and I believe that is original. I've never seen it in Latin or English in any other version of the Black Mass. There's also dancing involved a little later by the congregants toward the end of the Mass, which I haven't seen in other Black Masses. It seems to be one of the most original ones out there, and again, I give the O&A credit for their composition of that. It's quite a good Mass, and I would recommend checking it out on their website. To their credit, and by their own admission, the person or persons who made up the Mass of Heresy admit freely that it's a variation of the Order of Nine Angles, O&A Mass, that's published in the Black Book of Satan, Volume 3. This Mass is also unique in some of its features. This Mass relies on Mars incense, if possible, to obtain. It's also very pro-National Socialist, pro-Hitler, and pro-white in its rites. It calls for the use of a swastika flag, a copy of Mein Kampf, if the warlock or witch has one, and a picture of Hitler. Another point to this Black Mass that's unique is that it appears to have been written by someone who is either gay or gay-friendly, because it does emphasize the need to free the bonds of people as far as sexual liberation goes for homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, or lesbian people. It believes that the white race is Satan's race, and the element of blood is used in this Mass, although in a very minor way. It calls for the use of red wine or another deep red beverage. It suggests cranberry juice, for instance, and suggests just a couple of drops of blood being obtained from one's finger and intermingled with the beverage therein. Jehovah and the Jews in general are also blasphemed quite readily in that ceremony. And again, this is most likely a copyrighted ceremony, so I won't read it word for word, but I will recommend it to anyone who's interested, and I'll post the link to their website at this time. One of the shortest and most basic of the Black Mass ceremonies is handed down to us from a group calling itself the Church of the Fallen. It was compiled in 2003 by a person named David L. Litz. The ingredients to the Mass are very simple: altar, black altar cloth, one white, one black candle, other black candles for illumination, black bread, chalice, wine, a pitcher of water for the waters of life, aspergian, and a small black cloth to cover the chalice and paten. The ceremony follows the basic Black Mass line as far as the black robes for all participants, the invocation to Satan. The denunciation is varied slightly by rewording the basic text that was used in Labas and Missa Solemnis and LaVey's Mass. There is also the difference of using water for the blessing instead of urine as used in the Missa Solemnis, as well as other previously discussed Black Masses. This Mass is separated into the parts of a basic introitus, although it's not called that. There is no Latin used during this Mass. It's just a beginning, offertory, canon, consecration, and the closing, in which the standard ringing of the bell is done. The priests make the sign of the inverted cross, all candles are extinguished, and all leave the ritual chamber. This same group came up with a solo version of Mass, which basically, like my solo version of the Missa Solemnis, essentially sticks to the same text in essence and only eliminates the parts that require other participants in the Mass. In 2011, I wrote a ceremony that I titled Pure Blasphemy, and the title basically says it all. The requirements for the ritual are a table, desk, chair, or similar piece of furniture to serve as an altar, animal waste to be used as the quote-unquote host, a Star of David symbol or drawing with a picture of Adolf Hitler above it, a crucifix symbol or drawing that should be inverted, the face of the Nazarene may also be desecrated, a Muslim symbol such as the crescent that is hung with bacon strips, a Wiccan pentacle symbol that is punctured with holes, gloves for handling the putrid host, a lighter or matches, an accelerant for the fire, a bell, and as many black candles as are needed. The ceremony is just as it sounds. It's basically just a pure, blasphemous rite that is to be done to expunge Judeo-Christianity from one's mind. Quotes from the Marquis de Sade are also read throughout the ceremony. The Pater Noster, Our Father, is read in reverse in Latin. Bibles are ripped up. Holy symbols are spat upon, burned, shit upon, however you wish to do it. Religious statues are decapitated, smashed to pieces. So-called sacred altar cloths are torn to bits or burned, and hymns are played backwards during the ritual. The desecration of the Missa Solemnis, i.e. Labas, from 1891, is also read in its entirety, and the ceremony is closed with the words, "The so-called God of the Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Wiccans has been utterly destroyed, raped, and cast into the garbage bin of history by our unholy and blasphemous actions this night. So it is done." Nema, which is amen backwards. The music of the black metal band Profanatica is especially recommended for this ritual, as they are, from what I have found, the most blasphemous of all the black metal bands. We notice urination being used as part of the Mass in the Leclerc Mass, the Missa Solemnis, La Messe Noire, and the Missa Negere. We also notice bat's blood being mentioned by both Agrippa and later by Guiborg. In conclusion, I just want to point out that the Black Mass has survived excommunications, interrogations, purgings, terror, slander, floggings, hangings, burnings, white light denunciations, and infiltrations for at least the past 7 centuries. I have every confidence that this, the most unholy of all satanic rites, will continue for another 7 centuries, if not more. Missa Nigeria today, Le Missa Noire tomorrow, Missa Solemnis forever, Ego denego Jesum Christi discipio, down with the kikes, introibo ad altare de nostre Satanas Luciferi, Ave Satanas, Diabolos vobiscum. Ave, Black Mass. Hail, Satan.